Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Nico Leicht, and I'm a project leader in Aurora's Berlin advisory team focusing on market design in the German power sector. Today, we have a very special guest on the show, Anna von Bremen, who is a partner and head of energy innovation at Osborne Clarke, to discuss the regulation of power markets in a larger sense, with a focus today on flexibility and battery storage. Anna advises players in the industry on regulatory and energy law issues, digitalization, and conducts regulatory litigation cases. Her clients include energy producers, energy trading houses, industrial off-takers, and utilities. She's been with Osborne Clarke since 2023, and before has been 11 years at another Berlin-based law firm where she made partner. On top of that, Anna by now is a long-standing friend of Aurora and has been at this show before. So Anna, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Nico. Great to be here.
Happy to have you. And if I do my job well, we will spend the next 20 to 30 minutes exploring security of supply in Germany and what regulation we need to ensure it, how the energy transition monitoring can impact flexibility in the German power sector with a focus on battery storage, and then further regulations that impact the business model of battery storage in Germany. And we can frame all of this under the headline that you, Anna, have also recently used in a LinkedIn post of yours. Are we at a turning point in the energy transition? And maybe to give a bit of an intro, last week, we were hosting at Aurora our German flagship event, the Energy Transition Summit here in Berlin with more than 250 guests. And also there we sort of split the day in two pieces, discussing first security of supply in Germany, and then later also focusing on the co-location of renewable assets with battery storage and the build-out of renewables. And it really does feel like we're at a critical moment. We see on the one hand that costs for renewables and battery storage are strongly declining. And while there's some need for change, also on the regulatory side, sort of the build out on the supply side is working well and progressing fast. However, there is on the one hand a struggle with electrification. So we see demand is rising slower than anticipated. And also, there's much more challenges with the grid and connecting all of these assets to the system as a second point. And finally, there's also a stronger focus on the cost of the transition. So with that in mind, I want to sort of come to the first topical block of the podcast today, and it is security of supply with a focus on capacity instruments. And also there, we've sort of gone through a journey. 10 years ago, there was the decision in Germany to move ahead with an energy-only market with some reserves. Now we're discussing capacity instruments. And the reason why there has been such a fundamental change in energy policy is, on the one hand, the gas crisis. We've seen prices spike enormously, and we've seen policy intervention. We are finding ourselves in a much different situation, going from a situation of overcapacity with lots of coal plants in the market to rather undercapacity. And we're also, with climate change progressing much faster, we also are in a situation where the speed of transformation needs to be much faster. So this is why already the last ministry had introduced the plan to bring new gas plants into the market with a so-called power plant strategy. And this is now one of the key discussion points in energy policy for 2.5 years nearly. Now, there's a new plan, there's a new ministry, and what I think our listeners also are very keen to understand is with the current plan to first bring some gas plants online via this power plant strategy and later introduce a capacity market, how fast can all of this go and what could be potential regulatory hurdles? So Anna, help us out here. How feasible are some of the timelines that are suggested, starting with the power plant strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Nico. So yes, we do have like an ambitious plan. I think there were several announcements by the minister, also by the state secretary at the Aurora event, that we will have either the first tenders already this year, or at least like a very clear picture of how the tenders would look like. So I'm not a politician. I can't look into Brussels. What I can do is reading the law and looking at the timelines that are in there. So as of today, I think we don't have a draft though, and we don't really have any news from Brussels where the journey is going. What we do have is a security on supply report by the Federal Network Agency calculating a minimum of 20 gigawatt supply gap in 2035. these are basically more or less new numbers, just a few weeks old, that are lying on the table of the officials in Brussels. And they basically form the basis of anything that's going to be done in Germany regarding tendering gas-fired power plants. So my assumption would be that these numbers will have to be analyzed in Brussels, and at least for a few weeks. And Brussels might have some questions on the underlying assumptions of that report. So I would suspect that this takes at least another, let's say, 5 to 6 weeks for Brussels and Berlin, to discuss these numbers that are actually underlying the strategy. Also considering that under the state aid rules, the report underlying those plans must not be older than 12 months. So the minister cannot rely on anything that was published 2023 under the Habeck government, but we indeed need to present new numbers to Brussels. And this has basically just happened a few weeks ago. So let's say there's another 6 weeks to come. I think Frank Wetzel, the state secretary, has pointed out at the Aurora event that they are working in parallel on a draft bill. So let's assume this work is indeed done in parallel, and we are already, shaping the details of the tender procedure, which would mean that then in 6 weeks down the road, if this is very ambitious, we will have a green light from Brussels, and at the same time, we may have a draft bill of all the details of the tender procedure. So then the process is basically taken over by the state aid guidelines, meaning that the minister will have to conduct a public consultation of this draft bill, which has to take at least 4 weeks according to that guidelines. And together with this consultation, the minister will have to publish a questionnaire. Some may remember that the same was done by Mr. Habeck at the end of 2024, where he published his draft bill together with those, I think, 30 questions to the industry. Then the law basically prescribes that the industry, if the industry responds, that the minister has to analyze the responses and possibly draw conclusions from those responses, and fashion that into the bill. So we have another, let's say, 6 weeks for the consultation, and then if we are super ambitious, everybody's reading those responses and evaluating them within another 2 weeks. So that makes us landing, I think, at the end of the year, more or less, until this consultation procedure that is mandatory under state aid guidelines is done. So at some point, I think also the current government has to make up their mind, right? The minister has to get its coalition partner, the Social Democratic Party, into the boat. And I would assume that, the Social Democrats will also have their opinion on how this future gas tendering procedure would look like. So assuming again that this all is sort of taken on in parallel, we will need another, let's say, at least 2 weeks, until there's an official draft bill by the whole government, also including the Social Democrats, which makes us landing in the middle of January. Then normally we would involve the Federal Council, the Bundesrat, which would be the first one who's looking at this draft bill. So that procedure can be shortened to 3 weeks at a minimum, which would make us arrive in mid of February. Then again, the draft bill would be passed on to the parliament. And again, very optimistic, there will be a pause between the first and the second reading, where all the Ausschüsse are going to be involved and are going to also publish their opinion on how this future and procedure will have to look like. So we're landing, I think, in the middle of March. And then again, the Bundesrat has another 3 weeks to face any objections, which makes us landing in April. Finally, I think at that point, the law could enter into force under all of these very optimistic assumptions. But then again, we have statements by Mr. Müller, heading the Federal Network Agency, and also Barbie Haller, who's in charge of tendering, that they need at least 7 months in order to prepare the first auctions, which would make us look at, I think, November of next year. So I think the announcement that we will have a tender this year is totally unrealistic. And of course, we can ask ourselves, does the Federal Network Agency need 7 months to prepare that? But I think as a lawyer, I would anticipate that, these tenders will be challenged, and the results of the tenders will definitely be challenged by the companies who are not awarded. So I assume there is a desire, by the Federal Network Agency to set that up in a way that makes it difficult, for parties to challenge the result of that.
Wow. Yeah, thanks, Anna, for this very, very detailed timeline. I mean, of course, this does seem like we're a year behind the current plan, nearly. Is it fair to summarize? I mean, you've always said sort of in an optimistic world, each of these individual steps. So is it fair to say that this is rather the lower end? And but or do you see any room to speed things up there? Is there anything that can be parallelized or anything that can be avoided?
Yeah, I think there may be a little bit of wiggle room regarding the involvement of the Federal Council of the Bundesrat. So, of course, also the current government can bring the law into the parliament, and then the parliament wouldn't have to involve the Bundesrat first, which saves us another 3 weeks. But considering that all of these assumptions are really, really optimistic, also regarding the preparation of the draft bill and the anticipation of Brussels' opinion while drafting the bill at the moment, I still think that we would probably realistically rather look at 2027 instead of 2026.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. And then maybe a follow-up question that is not purely legal, but I mean, how big is the additional challenge that we're going into this process the second time now, right? Because already the old government had a consultation phase. They went to Brussels. They went to Brussels with a separate security of supply monitoring report that said we don't have a capacity gap. Now the new government comes with a new security of supply report that has a capacity gap of 20 gigawatts. Is that an additional challenge?
Yeah, I think it is indeed. I mean, the old report was basically published at the peak of the gas supply crisis. And my feeling would be that the Federal Network Agency also tried to calm the public a bit down by saying, we don't have a supply gap. And now it seems that we are sort of trying to get the numbers in the other direction. So there may be some contradictions between these two reports that will be at least challenged by Brussels. And yes, indeed, I mean, the agreement with Brussels is now only, 11 months old. So I think it is a kind of a tough one for Mrs. Leicht and her team, to present new numbers and to get this agreement directed, towards a higher capacity gap that we are looking at. So indeed challenging. And I think Frank Wetzel also sort of pointed out that he said that very diplomatically, but I felt that he was a bit annoyed also by the fact that there were already, a set opinion by Brussels that for them it's really hard to change at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and always tough to change something that has been agreed before, right?
Indeed, yeah.
And maybe to move a bit from timeline to content. I mean, so what is the government trying to do? Of course, as we discussed, right, this is now coming strongly from a security of supply perspective. So the idea is to bring new gas plants online. But I mean, at the same time, if we think about the energy trilemma, decarbonization, security of supply, and affordability, then of course also decarbonization is something that has been written in law by the German Constitutional Court. So it can't really it can't really be ignored. Now, previously the plan was to sort of roughly speaking split these gas plants in half, have half of them focused on pure gas generation with a security of supply focus, half of them rather focused on very quick decarbonization to also pilot hydrogen in the German power sector. What is your view there? So which conditions will the Commission likely place on these tenders? And what has it to do with state aid, and how does it compare also later to the capacity market?
Yeah, so I mean, the guidelines are stated are quite specific on gas-fired generation. So they do see and acknowledge that gas-fired power plants obviously have a positive impact on security of supply, but generally describes that the member states must somehow evidence how they avoid, a fossil lock-in and how that technology is supposed to contribute to 2040 and 2050 targets. So any state aid to fossil generation must obviously have some sort of end date. And looking at the fact that the 2050 target is net zero, this obviously means that we have to have some switch to H2 or other technologies like CCS, CCU, that must take place before 2050 in order to get that net zero target done. So I think looking at Germany, CCS, CCU is not really an up-and-running concept here at the moment. So I would guess that we are looking at some sort of H2 readiness discussion, as was also the case under the old career ski law under the Harvard Ministry. So yeah, if we're looking again at the likelihood of the outcome, I'm afraid that the current government will not really be able to achieve completely different negotiation results from what was already achieved with Brussels. And I think that is also sort of indicated by Mrs. Leicht when she talks about the Schnellboot, which will amount to supplies 5 gigawatts of gas-fired power generation that is only H2 ready, but that will be, transposed to actual H2 feed and at a very, very later point in time. So yeah, again, I mean, the new security of supply report may give the government a bit of more wiggle room to get to a higher number, but of course that is that the EU Commission actually buys all the assumptions underlying the report, which hopefully may be the case, but probably not to 100%.
Okay, good to hear. Additional challenges ahead there. Now you've mentioned the Schnellboot or speedboat, but the strategy is of course twofold. So after the speedboat, the ministry is looking at the capacity market. So then a second instrument to bring new capacity into the market, but they are hopefully then also on the one hand more cost effective, but then also more technology neutral way. Now, maybe starting with this very contentious word, what does technology neutrality mean for a capacity market?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. I mean, technology neutrality obviously means that, everybody can participate from the outset. So you may not discriminate on a specific technology unless, this is due to targets that are related to climate protection, etc. So yes, all the market players will be able to participate. Battery will be able to participate. I think that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to be treated exactly the same despite the technology he's using. So on the legal aspects, if discrimination is allowed, but only if there's a valid reason for it. So looking at, for example, a 2-hour battery and then comparing that to a gas-fired power plant, I think if we are looking at a central capacity market like in the UK, there is a case that, there might be introduced rating factors that do indeed lead to lower revenues of batteries because of their, 2-hour limitation and duration. Of course, there's a technical reason why they might not contribute to security of supply in the same way as would a gas-fired power plant. So I think we need to make sure that these sort of allowed discriminations are adequate so that they are not exceeding what is actually justified by the underlying technology. But I think in the end, regarding the overall revenues by that market, we will probably see differentiations, at least in a centralized capacity market. I think it may be a bit different if we look at peak price hedging technologies, because they're basically the market decides on who gets what. So it may well be, that people are sort of combining projects in a different way, aggregating smaller batteries to larger VPPs, etc. So it may well be that I think the industry gets creative and is, try to lower down this rating factor applied for BESS. But I think definitely there will be differentiations depending on technology, and that will not violate the principle that it has to be technology neutral.
Yeah, no, perfect, makes sense. And I mean, indeed, the contribution is different. I mean, on the one hand, for technical reasons, but then also due to market dynamics, right? Even if a battery has like 2 or 4 hour storage depths, that does not necessarily mean that in the most critical moments it will be there for 4 hours because it might have dispatched already before. So it's sort of challenging, but of course you also want to leverage this like non-fossil flexibility as much as you can, and that I understand has been one of the key challenges in existing capacity markets, especially when it comes to, for instance, demand side response, which is even harder to classify than battery storage. Now, sort of we started the discussion with timelines. I want to close this chapter, unfortunately, again with timelines. but again, so we want to move ahead here quickly. We have 30 gigawatts of coal plants in this still in the system. So if we can reduce the emissions in the power sector, good. The new minister announced 2 weeks ago that the plan for the capacity markets is 2027. From your perspective, is that something that is reasonable if a more standardized approach is taken, like the Belgian one or the British one that had been approved in the past?
Yeah, so in theory, I think it might be. So from the state aid view, the same procedures would apply as those for the gas tender that we discussed before. So looking at that timeline again, there's no statutory ground for saying it's completely unrealistic. Just only looking at the law that will be finished in 2027. So yes, I think it's possible, and of course, depending a bit on whether the Belgian or the UK market is sort of used as the role model in order to get the officials in Brussels in the right direction. Personally, I personally don't think that the current government can really, let's say, beat the Habeck plan, because firstly, I mean, we haven't seen any sort of white paper so from the current government, such as this market design of the future, Strommarktdesign der Zukunft, where we had those clear 4 options and weighing all the factors that are pros and cons of those 4 options. So even the concept is not really clear yet. I think there has been some rumor about the current government favoring a centralized capacity market, but we haven't seen anything on paper. So that sort of strikes me as strange if you want to be part of that current government and you haven't even decided on the concept yet. Again, also the Brussels discussions hasn't really started yet. So I think regarding the 5 gigawatt discussion, speedboat discussion, at least there has been, some conversation with Brussels going on. I think that's not really the case for the capacity market. So there we really would have to start from scratch, and then depending obviously how much we copy existing models, that may take definitely longer than the discussion that is there at the moment. Plus, I mean, capacity market in general is a much more, I think, complex project than this single getting the gas-fired power plants tenders of 5 gigawatts. So I mean, we have to look at interfaces to the current gas tenders. We have to look at interfaces to the new safety mechanism. So it's a bit of a bigger project, and it definitely requires some more brain work than I think the already complex current gas tenders.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems like a bigger fish to fry, so to say. Now, having heard all of this, it seems like all of this is feasible, but it's taking time, and sort of on top of the timelines that you have mentioned, sort of from the political and legal side, of course, there's the times to build the assets. So, I think this is actually a good transition, because if we think that we arrive at somewhere 2027 as a starting point of the power plant strategy, that means we'll likely have first new firm assets being built 2032 at the earliest. So that means that actually we need to also, until then, focus on other forms of flexibility that can come into the market faster. So that can be on the demand side, on the supply side, and also for other reasons, right? Because we see that, for instance, the capture prices of renewable assets are falling, especially on the solar side. So we really have to think of what else we can do. Now, as part of the presentation of the energy transition monitoring, the minister also presented a sort of 10 key measures that energy policy should focus on now. Maybe starting with that, of these 10 points, how could this contribute to flexibility in the German power sector? And also particularly on one element that you had also mentioned during the summit, that is your one hope that we can finally speed up the rollout of smart meters. So what's your perspective there? How helpful can this be?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not solving the whole problem, right? Because the gigawatts underlying demand response are maybe not the whole story, but I think it's like a low-hanging fruit to catch, right? And if we look at the energy transition monitoring, what I find very telling regarding smart meter rollout is that the experts basically say that there is a prosecution and an enforcement deficit by the Federal Network Agency regarding smart meter rollout. So I mean, we have to achieve a share of, I think, 20% of the customer group above 6,000 kilowatt hours per year consumption. This year, that has to be receiving smart meters until the end of the year. And the report basically states that there's a number of, I think, 200 or 270 DSOs that hasn't installed a single smart meter to date. And the report also says that there's basically no pressure on those DSOs, because the Federal Network Agency, besides sending, friendly reminders to those companies, it hasn't really used any sort of enforcement action that they are actually empowered to do under the underlying law. So I'm asking myself why we are not trying to tackle this seemingly very easy problem, being the last one in Europe who is actually, still rolling out smart meters, which everybody else has done before. What frightens me a bit is the statement by Mrs. Reich is saying that she will see the responsibility for the rollout with the DSOs only in the future. Because the DSOs are really not the players who have achieved amazing results in the past 13 years on the smart meter rollout. So I guess in order to make this fly, there needs to be a business case behind demand flexibility. And those business cases are there, and many clients of mine are really engaged in those business cases and offering money, especially many young companies are offering actually, value propositions to the market. And these companies, because the official rollout has been so slow, they have become competitive metering point operators, is the nice German term. And they are trying to, foster the development. And if we kick those companies out of the market by saying in the future only the DSOs are in charge of smart meter rollout, I think this is even going to slow down the process more, because again, then there's no business case behind this, and this is just all, state regulation, and nobody really wants those meters if there's no business case behind it. So yeah, I would hope that we are rather trying to look at a market solution for that instead of getting state in charge to get that process done.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that, of course, ideally we have a sort of market-based solution for this. I mean, the commentary I've heard so far was that it could also, I mean, the one positive aspect could be that now the DSOs would have an incentive to install them, which they didn't really have before, besides the friendly reminders you mentioned. Because now it seems that the smart meters will be part of their regulated asset base, so they receive a, let's say, decent compensation for this. But you have a different perspective. You think this might actually be detrimental?
Well, that may be, I think, indeed a good point, to get those processes speed up. What I find difficult is that it will be the sole responsibility of the DSOs, right? I think we shouldn't push competitive third-party market actors out of it. I think we can go both ways, making it attractive for the DSOs to install the smart meters, at the same time, allowing third-party non-utility companies to act as an metering point operator as well.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. No, I mean, forcing competitive business models out of market doesn't seem something worthwhile pursuing. Speaking of competitive business models, I mean, we currently see that battery storage is being built in Germany. I mean, as I said also earlier, there's lots of challenges, grid fees. We'll come to that hopefully in a bit still. But how is battery storage affected by some of the elements we've discussed so far? And I'm thinking, for instance, of offtake agreements. So maybe could you help our listeners with that? So maybe first, what are some of these offtake agreements that we're seeing? I understand that you are engaged in negotiating and helping to draft some of these. And then how can these be impacted, or how might these be impacted by some of the capacity instruments we're also discussing? Because one could, of course, take the stance that capacity instruments can be beneficial for battery storage because they could receive payments from them, but there might also be other drawbacks, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, in general, from a very, wide angle, of course, the capacity instrument is more or less easy to implement, I think, into the current revenue stacking strategy of many optimizers, because it's just like the underlying basis. And then, it only affects the other revenue streams if the capacity market is really called upon and activated. So I think in general, it's something that is useful for the business case. However, looking at the current, decisions that market actors have to take, you probably need some sort of fixed price offtake arrangement, at least regarding a share of the capacity, in order to get project finance for this project, which automatically means that we are looking at some sort of tolling agreement, so some sort of fixed price arrangement for the uptake of the flexibility from the battery. And any sort of fixed price contract always depends on the forecasts of future investment conditions, especially from the offtake side, right? So the more vague the future framework is, the more difficult it is for the offtake side to really calculate revenues, especially if some market actors participate or anticipate that the capacity market is going to affect the peak prices like it indeed does in some jurisdictions already. And if that does, it helps plus support that makes the calculation of revenues and the agreement on a certain price level more difficult. So yeah, indeed, that would profit on the long run, but currently, as always, insecurity and investment condition is making this price arrangement more difficult.
Yeah, makes sense. So unsurprisingly, clarity is good. Very good. Let's maybe move on then, and a bit away sort of from the immediate implications of the energy transition monitoring. But if we think about the business model of battery storage in large, there's one new very interesting term that is going around in the industry, which is grid friendliness. But I think generally it's fair to say that there is a challenge of bringing market and grid together. To make sort of the German example is that we see a lot of congestion already now, and we expect this congestion to become even bigger. We have lots of offshore wind that we want to build out in the North Sea. Not all of that power can be transported south. We have pumped hydro in the south. We have the demand clusters in the south and the west. So we're looking at situations where offshore wind in the north will have to be curtailed. The power price is low. Pumped hydro is demanding power, and we have gas or coal plants in the south producing these electrons that are then demanded by the pumped hydro storage. So all of that is challenging and yeah, it needs a solution. So several options are discussed here. Their price zone split seems off the table for now, but thinking about battery storage and grid friendliness, maybe first, what do you think does grid friendliness actually mean? And then secondly, we can move to the current process that the German government is envisioning to incentivize this grid friendliness, the Agnes process, or as I found out in English, the General Network Tariff System proceedings.
Very nice, my word. Yeah, I mean, grid friendliness is a tricky one. So, I mean, first of all, I think also one of your panelists said earlier last week that gas are the only assets that have to act in a grid friendly way, and why should we do so? We're like everybody else. So I think that's a general question to ask. Where does it come from that suddenly a customer has to stay on the grid, which is actually a task for the grid operator, not the customer. I think secondly, we can talk about grid friendliness, but it needs to be done, in a way that both parties sort of use best efforts in order to do their own homework. So what we're seeing now in the market that, there are various concepts for grid friendliness, and it seems to me that some of them are also imposed in an excessive way, limiting best energy to certain hours, or even granting the grid operator the right to basically curtail at any time without compensation. So from the regulatory viewpoint, I think there is a really strong danger that we are mixing up grid friendliness with redispatch. And we do have a redispatch regime that we fought for, I think, for a very long time, and that I think 2 or 3 court cases until now, the final redispatch compensation is set. So it was hard work, also the Federal Network Agency and the industry, to get a fair redispatch compensation. And now we have a model. Of course, it's costly, but it's the fair compromise for both sides. And if grid friendliness means, and it does apparently mean, according to some TSOs or DSOs, that you can curtail the asset in case of a congestion without compensation. This is just like a redispatch for free mechanism that is actually not allowed by law, but we do see tendencies also in our daily advice that the DSOs are understanding the concept in this way. And I think this is indeed very dangerous, because obviously it's, affecting strongly the business case and making ultimately investment in gas impossible. If you have an unrestricted and non-compensated curtailment mechanism called grid-friendly operation. So I think indeed, if we want to go for this concept, we sort of need the regulator. I know it's a German thing to always ask for rules, but in this case, I think as we're talking about a monopolist player on one side, we indeed need, some framework for that to make that work in a smart way. That's the first point. And I think the second point is also that the grid operator indeed needs to also do their homework regarding digitalization. So from what I've heard is that some grid operators also face challenges because they don't see their grids in a real-time granularity as they are supposed to do. And then the best is just an asset that is acting too fast. So basically disappearing in 1 minute and then going back online in the second minute. And this is something that, the grid operator cannot see. So if we're talking about grid friendliness, I think the first condition is that the grid operator, gets its processes done. And also regarding redispatch, many grid operators were not able to do redispatch, and they are now relying on this grid friendliness thing because they haven't done their homework with regard to their redispatch processes. So I think as long as, one side hasn't done their best efforts to operate the asset without restrictions, we can't really impose those restrictions on one side, as long as there's still a deficit. So I find the whole discussion indeed very dangerous, and I think we need some clearer picture of it, and regarding the terms, but also regarding the conditions and which a DSO is actually entitled to look at grid friendliness at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, good points. The one sort of element where probably I could see a potential challenge is I agree with you that the current redispatch process was sort of hard fought for and seems to work. The question probably would be, does it work in the future, right? Because it's easy to curtail an offshore wind farm. It's going to be much harder in the future if we're talking about a much more decentralized power system, also on the demand side. And so this might make the whole process much more challenging, and it's very unclear how would you compensate an industrial off-taker whose demand is turned off. So I think the redispatch process might become much more complex in the future, but probably your answer would be that can be resolved if we have the right digitalization and the right systems in place, I would assume.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, I think from what I hear, at least in the industry, nobody really has a problem with being, dispatched, even compensation free in a few hours of the year, as long as you can put a number on it and somehow fashion that into your business goals, it's fine. If it's just about a few hours, I think the industry is happy to help. But we need clear conditions in order to calculate prices and in order to calculate costs. And if those are as fuzzy as at the moment, that's basically a killer for the project.
Yeah. Any speculation on what might come out of the ACNAS process, especially for battery storage? Any indication that the regulator has done?
So I don't have any breaking news insider information, unfortunately. So I guess, the options are on the table are the BKZ on the one side, which is sort of a done topic, at least for BESS below 100 megawatts. And then we do have capacity prices and dynamic variable prices, right? And the question is, are we going to have those? Are we going to have maybe one of those? I think the capacity prices seem to be an option, but even though they're easy to calculate for the network operator, of course, they are a layer threat for the business case. At least if, they are changing every year, as is the current mechanism for capacity prices. So I think indeed that is a dangerous thing to look at if it's not fashioned in a way that, leads to the required security of investment. And then we have the dynamic variable prices, which I think were also sort of recommended by Liam Heard in his EcoStore study, which is like the second best option after the price zone split apparently. So I think those would make perfect sense from an economic viewpoint. I think in Germany with 800 DSOs, it is a bit challenging to implement that, at least in the smart way that it has to be designed in order to really get to the results that we want to achieve. So, I mean, we do have some variable pricing under the 14A ENWG Energy Wirtschaftsgesetz regulation today. And here the network operator only has to develop 3 price levels, which are totally static. It's a super easy mathematical task to do. And still we see like a various number of DSOs that does not achieve those 3 simple price levels and doesn't publish those on its website. So if I would imagine that all of these DSOs would then have to go for dynamic prices depending on specific risk congestion scenarios, I think that is something that is rather like a a far cut to make. So my guess would be that we will maybe have some sort of capacity prices, but that are not as variable as they are today, changing on a yearly basis, and some maybe very, very moderate variable prices, which, however, will probably not be 100% dynamic in the way they should be.
Yeah. No, thanks for going down there and helping us to speculate. And I mean, just we're power market forecasters, so if there's dynamic grid fees, this would of course be a great modeling challenge for us. But I also understand that from an investment perspective, you rather want certainty and have clarity. So that's gonna make it more challenging. It was also one of the statements that was made during the summit.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Good. Maybe with a last content bit, there were certain changes, and if we think about battery projects and especially co-located projects, co-location is becoming much more common. But there's always the question on, are we talking about an only green battery storage, or can gray power be used? So there were certain adjustments already made earlier this year that should allow an easier combination of gray and green power. Could you maybe very briefly outline what these were and whether they are helpful from your perspective, or whether they need extension?
Yeah, so I think we're looking at the solar package one, right? So we have these three options on the table where you can combine green and gray. I think one is not really a new option, but that's only the exclusivity principle, Ausschließlichkeitsprinzip, that we already had before. So you cannot mix green and gray during one calendar year unless you're fine losing your EEG subsidy. So that is the Ausschließlichkeitsprinzip. And then we have these two other options where you are trying to set green and gray power apart by the metering concept you're using. So my speculation would be that that is especially applicable to utility scale BESS, as they are obviously happy to do this investments in those separate meters in order to set those two volumes apart. And then we have the lump sum option, Pauschaloption, which is, however, still subject to state aid approval, right? And we unfortunately didn't get it on our conference from Frank Wetzel, when he was asked whether the state aid approval is already knocking on the door. So we still have to wait here, but I think that one is especially useful for, let's say, supply companies for residential customers, right? That do not want to make the investment in several meters, as you know, it's a small margin business case, so it doesn't make sense to get all those meters installed in your home storage, etc. So I think that one is very well received indeed, and was a very good initiative of the Federal Network Agency, who was often pushing for that lump sum approach. And it allows to cloud residential customers together to a virtual power plant, and then to do home storage arbitrage at the same time, plus shifting generation from peak hours to evening hours, and making all of those homes indeed smart homes. So I think that one is rather passion for the residential area, and I think both ones are really, really indeed helpful. Definitely one step forward towards the co-location discussion. The remaining challenges, again, the network connection, right? So we need to have, coming back to the flexible connection agreement, clear picture of how can we exceed the network congestion capacity, so making the Überbau in German, and I think here we haven't seen much flexibility from the grid operators yet. So I think that would be like the last challenge that we need to tackle, and then I think the green gray mix can fly, possibly.
Can take off. Perfect. Very interesting. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Anna. Any final thoughts for our listeners? Also, maybe connected to a question: if we are at a turning point, how can we make this a positive turning point?
So I'm not really sure, to be honest, if we're at a turning point. I mean, it is communicated as a turning point, but when I look at what is actually written on paper, I can't see the turn yet. So I think we are at a point where we are trying to reevaluate the numbers, and we are trying to, get any sort of policy thinking in green and gray off the table to really get more rational about what we're doing in Germany. But I think the regulatory framework also, you mentioned the climate targets, etc. I think we've already decided for the way forward. Now we are looking at, whether we are making little curves on that way. But indeed, I think I would contradict the statement also by Bangetsu on your panel. I don't think we are at a turning point. I think we're just at a point where we are, trying to get things more efficient and more rational and possibly speed up things. But I think it's too late to make a turn. We've made so many decisions in Germany, stepping out of coal, stepping out of nuclear. I think now what we have to do is to get the technicality straight and to have a very good regulation in order to, to take the next steps. But I think it's not the time for general discussions on where we're heading. I think we're already headed somewhere.
Perfect. Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Anna. Thanks for joining us on the show today. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast again and learning from your experience on energy regulation.
Pleasure, Nico. Until next time.
That was Nico Leicht, project leader in Aurora's Berlin advisory team, focusing on market design in the German power sector, talking to Anna von Bremen, who's a partner and head of energy innovation at Osborne Clarke. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.